In September 2019, a man sat in a glass-walled office on the 45th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper and watched his empire disappear in real time. Not over years, not over months, in weeks, in days. In the time it takes for the truth to catch up with a story that was never quite as solid as it sounded. His name was Adam Neumann, and the number that had defined everything he had built, everything he had promised, everything he had told the world he was worth, $47 billion, was evaporating with a speed that left the people who had believed in him struggling to understand what they were actually watching. Because this was not a market crash. This was not a recession. This was not an act of God or a global event or an external force that no one could have anticipated or prevented. This was something far more specific, yet far more personal, far more difficult to look at directly and call by its actual name. This was a man who had been warned, repeatedly and by serious people whose judgment had been earned over decades, that the choices he was making were going to end exactly the way they were ending. And who had looked at every single one of those warnings from every single one of those serious people and decided that they were wrong and he was right. Not because he had evidence they were wrong, not because he had a counter-argument that addressed their concerns, but because he was Adam Neumann, and Adam Neumann did not lose, until the day he did. Before we go any deeper into this story, we would love to know where in the world you are watching from right now. Drop it in the comments below, we read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, you hit that subscribe button right now because what is coming over the next hour is one of the most extraordinary stories of pride, power, and self-destruction in the history of American business. And you are going to want to be here for all of it. The story of WeWork, the real story, not the version that appeared in the press releases and the investor presentations and the S1 prospectus that described the company's mission as elevating the world's consciousness, is a story about what happens when a genuinely extraordinary human being becomes so completely convinced of his own exceptional nature that he loses the ability to distinguish between his vision and reality, between what he believes is true and what is actually true, between the story he is telling and the business he is running. It is a story about the specific and devastating kind of damage that unchecked pride can do, not just to a balance sheet, but to the thousands of ordinary people who trusted someone with their careers and their savings and their futures, and their belief that the person at the top of the organization they had given themselves to was, at some fundamental level, looking out for them. Adam Neumann was, by almost every account of the people who knew him and worked with him and invested in him, a genuinely remarkable human being. He had a physical presence that filled rooms. He had a way of speaking about his vision that made people feel, while they were in the room with him, that they were in the presence of someone who could actually see the future. He had an energy that was, by most descriptions, almost impossible to resist when it was directed at you. And he had a talent for the particular kind of storytelling that makes the impossible sound not just possible but inevitable. These are not small gifts. They are, in fact, the precise gifts that the greatest entrepreneurs in history have possessed. The tragedy of Adam Neumann is not that he lacked those gifts. It is what he did with them, and what he refused to do when the moment came to set them down and face something harder and quieter and more honest than any story he had ever told. WeWork was founded in 2010 in New York City by Adam Neumann and his co-founder Miguel McKelvey. The concept, at its core, was straightforward. They would lease large commercial office buildings, divide them into smaller, flexible workspaces, decorate them with the warm aesthetic of a creative community rather than the cold functionality of a corporate environment, and rent those spaces to freelancers, startups, and small businesses that needed professional space without the commitment of a traditional long-term commercial lease. It was not a revolutionary concept in the strictest sense. Shared office space had existed in various forms for decades before WeWork arrived. What was new, what Neumann brought to it, was the narrative. The conviction, articulated with extraordinary force and consistency, that WeWork was not a real estate company, that it was a technology company, a community company, a mission-driven organization that was going to change the fundamental nature of how human beings related to their work and to each other. And the narrative worked. For years. It worked with a power that defied almost every conventional measure of business performance. because the companies and the investors and the advisors who encountered it were not evaluating a business plan. They were responding to a feeling. And the feeling was that Adam Neumann was going somewhere important and that getting on board early was the most significant financial decision any of them would ever make. By 2019, WeWork had expanded to more than 500 locations in over 100 cities across 29 countries. It employed thousands of people. It had raised billions of dollars from some of the most sophisticated investors in the world, most prominently the Japanese technology conglomerate SoftBank and its founder Masayoshi Son, who had invested billions of dollars across multiple funding rounds and whose vision fund had been the primary driver of the extraordinary $47 billion valuation that WeWork carried into its planned initial public offering. The company had become, in the language of Silicon Valley and the financial press, a unicorn, a private company valued at over $1 billion, of such extraordinary scale that it occupied a category essentially by itself. It was, depending on which account you read and which moment in the timeline you chose to focus on, either the most exciting company in America or the most concerning one. And the distance between those two assessments, which would eventually become the story, was a distance that Adam Neumann's extraordinary confidence and extraordinary pride had spent years making it very difficult for anyone around him to acknowledge out loud. The warning signs were there. They were documented. They were discussed in private by people who were in a position to act on them and who chose, for reasons that this video is going to examine in detail, not to. The self-dealing property transactions in which Neumann purchased buildings personally and then leased them back to WeWork, creating a situation in which he was simultaneously the CEO deciding how much his company would pay for office space and the landlord receiving those payments. The trademark transaction in which he registered the word "we" as his personal intellectual property and then sold it back to the company he ran for $5.9 million before eventually being required to return the money when the arrangement became public. The governance structure that gave him approximately 20 times the voting power of ordinary shareholders, meaning that in any dispute about the direction of the company, his single vote would always overwhelm every other voice in the room. The reported incidents involving his personal conduct that generated legal concern among the company's advisors. The decision-making style that multiple former executives described, in accounts given to journalists after their departures, as operating according to a logic that was genuinely difficult to follow from the outside. All of it was there. All of it was known, at some level, by the people who were in the room. And none of it was sufficient for years to interrupt the momentum of a story that was generating too much money and too much excitement for the people benefiting from it to be willing to stop and ask whether the foundation beneath it was actually solid. That question, the one that should have been asked earlier and louder and with more consequence, finally got its answer in the autumn of 2019. And the answer, when it came, arrived not gradually but all at once, with the speed and the force of something that had been held back under enormous pressure for a very long time. The IPO prospectus that WeWork filed publicly in August of that year, the document that was supposed to be the triumphant announcement of the next great American corporate success story, became instead the instrument of the company's exposure. Because the prospectus, which was required by law to disclose the material financial facts about the business, revealed a company losing money at a rate and on a trajectory that the $47 billion valuation could not survive contact with. It revealed losses of $1.9 billion in 2018 alone. It revealed the governance arrangements that gave Neumann near absolute control. It revealed the self-dealing transactions. It revealed a path to profitability that the financial analyst who read it described as, at best, distant and uncertain, and, at worst, or not credibly articulated at all. And it revealed, in the language it used to describe the company's mission and purpose, the extraordinary degree to which the story had become the product. The word community appeared 150 times. The company's mission was described as elevating the world's consciousness. These were not the words of a business filing a routine regulatory disclosure. They were the words of a man who had spent so long inside his own narrative that he had, apparently, lost the ability to see how it looked from the outside. The financial press read the prospectus and responded with a directness and a unanimity that was, even by the standards of a media environment accustomed to scrutinizing corporate excess, striking in its clarity. The valuation was not defensible. The losses were not sustainable. The governance was not acceptable. The story was not a substitute for a business model. And the man telling the story, for all his extraordinary gifts, had surrounded himself so completely with people who were either true believers or too financially incentivized to raise objections, that the gap between what WeWork claimed to be and what it actually was had grown to a size that could no longer be managed by charisma and conviction alone. Within weeks of the prospectus filing, the IPO was withdrawn. Within days of the withdrawal, Neumann was gone. The $47 billion empire had become, in the space of an autumn, a cautionary tale. And the 2,400 people who would lose their jobs in the restructuring that followed were left to process what it meant to have given years of their lives and significant portions of their financial futures to a vision that had turned out to be, in the cold light of the market's assessment, worth a fraction of what they had been told. There are three questions that sit at the absolute center of the Adam Neumann and WeWork story. Three questions that every journalist who covered the collapse, every investor who lost money in it, every employee who gave years of their life to it, and every business school professor who has since used it as a case study has been turning over ever since. And tonight we are going to answer all three of them, not with a summary, not with a highlight reel of the most dramatic moments, but with the full story, told in the order it actually happened, with the details that most accounts leave out and the human texture that the financial headlines never quite manage to capture. So here are the three questions. First, how does a man with no technology product, no proprietary software, no patent, no scientific breakthrough, and no business model that had not existed in some form for decades before he arrived, convince the most sophisticated investors in the world to value his company at $47 billion? Not $10 billion, not $20 billion, $47 billion. For a company that was, at its core, renting office space and putting plants in the lobby. How does that happen? On what combination of personality and timing and cultural moment and financial incentive makes that level of collective suspension of disbelief not just possible but apparently irresistible to people whose entire professional identity is built around not being fooled? Second, how did the people with the most to lose see the warning signs, document the warning signs, discuss the warning signs among themselves, and still not act on them until the damage was essentially complete? The board members, the lawyers, the investment bankers, the advisors, the journalists who were reporting on WeWork during the years of its ascent and who had access to enough information to ask harder questions than most of them did. How does an organization that size, surrounded by that many sophisticated and well-compensated professionals, travel so far down a road that so many of them privately suspected was leading somewhere bad, without anyone pulling the emergency brake until the vehicle was already over the edge? And third, the question I think is the most important of the three, and the one that I believe has the most to say to every person watching this video, regardless of whether they have ever heard of WeWork or Adam Neumann before today. What does it feel like to be the person at the center of a story like this one? What does it feel like to have the gifts that Adam Neumann had, to build what he built, to stand where he stood at the peak of it, and then to watch it come apart in the specific way that it came apart? Not because of bad luck or external circumstance, but because of choices you made and warnings you ignored and a version of yourself that you refused, even when the evidence was overwhelming, to examine honestly? What does pride of that magnitude actually cost? Not in dollars. In the currency that matters more than dollars. In the relationships, the trust, the legacy, the answer to the question of what your time on Earth actually added up to. We are going to answer all three questions tonight. And we are going to do it through the real, documented, verified story of Adam Neumann and WeWork. A story that begins not in a glass-walled Manhattan skyscraper but in a kibbutz in Israel, with a boy who learned from the very beginning that the most important thing in any room was to be the person everyone else was watching. Before we go any deeper into this story, we would love to know where in the world you're watching from right now. Drop it in the comments below because we read every single one. And if you are not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what is coming in the next hour is something that is going to stay with you long after the video ends. Adam Neumann was born on April 25, 1979 in Tel Aviv, Israel. His parents divorced when he was young, and the instability that followed shaped the early years of his life in ways that people who knew him well have said he carried into his adult relationships and his professional behavior in ways both visible and subtle. He lived in multiple cities during his childhood. He attended a kibbutz in northern Israel called Nir Am, and later another called Ein Hamifratz. And it is here, in this detail of his upbringing that most accounts mention briefly before moving on, that I want to pause for a moment. Because the kibbutz is not simply a residential arrangement. It is a philosophy. It is the lived practice of the idea that community is more important than individual accumulation, that the collective well-being of the group takes precedence over the personal advancement of any single member. Are that the work each person does derives its meaning not from the personal wealth it generates, but from the contribution it makes to something larger than the individual. These are not abstract values in a kibbutz. They are the organizing principles of daily life. The food you eat, the housing you occupy, the work you perform, all of it is understood as part of a shared enterprise rather than a personal transaction. Adam Neumann grew up inside this philosophy. He absorbed it at the age when human beings absorb the values around them most completely and most permanently. And then he went to New York City and built a company whose entire brand identity was built on the language of community, of togetherness, of shared purpose, and of the idea that work could be something more meaningful than the exchange of labor for compensation. The distance between the genuine communal values of the kibbutz where he grew up and the commercialized version of community that WeWork sold to the world is one of the most interesting and most under-examined aspects of the entire story. He served in the Israeli Navy, as most young Israelis are required to do under the country's mandatory military service system, reaching the rank of officer before completing his service and making the decision that would set the rest of his life in motion. In 2001, at the age of 22, Adam Neumann moved to New York City with his sister Addie, who was pursuing a career in fashion, and with a degree of self-belief that the people who encountered him during those early New York years have consistently described as something qualitatively different from ordinary ambition. This was not the confidence of a young person who believed they were capable of success if they worked hard enough. This was the conviction of someone who had already decided, at a level below conscious argument, that success was not a possibility but a certainty, and that the only remaining question was how large the success was going to be and how long it was going to take to arrive. He enrolled in the Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College in New York, though he would later leave without completing his degree, which is a detail that sits interestingly alongside the culture he would eventually create at WeWork, where the mythology of the dropout founder, who trusted vision over credentials, became, in some respects, part of the company's identity. His early business ventures in New York were, by any objective measure, unsuccessful. He launched a company called Crawlers that sold collapsible knee pads designed to protect babies learning to crawl. The product was clever in concept, and Neumann threw himself into selling it with the energy and the persuasive force that would later become his trademark. But the company never achieved any significant commercial traction and eventually wound down without making a meaningful mark on the baby products market or on Adam Neumann's bank account. He tried other concepts. None of them worked in any substantial way. But what Neumann was doing during these years of business failure, which spanned most of the mid-2000s, was something that the people who observed him closely during this period have consistently noted as distinctive and, in retrospect, deeply revealing. He was learning how to perform success. He was studying, with the same intensity that he had brought to his military service, the mechanics of how powerful and wealthy people presented themselves to the world, how they spoke, how they moved through rooms, what they wore, how they created, through a combination of physical presence and verbal certainty and the strategic management of information, the impression that they were operating at a level that others could only aspire to reach. He was building, in other words, not a business but a persona. And the persona he was building was so compelling, so physically present, so apparently confident in its own extraordinary destiny, that the people who encountered it found it very difficult to look away. In 2008, Neumann was introduced to Miguel McKelvey, an architect from Eugene, Oregon, who had grown up in a commune, another interesting parallel to Neumann's kibbutz background, and who had come to New York to pursue his career in design. McKelvey was, in temperament and personality, almost the precise opposite of the man he would go on to co-found one of the most talked-about companies in American business history with. Where Neumann was loud and expansive and given to grand declarations about the transformative significance of whatever he was currently building, McKelvey was quiet, considered, and deeply focused on the craft of creating physical spaces that worked, that felt right to the people inside them in a way that was rooted in design intelligence rather than marketing language. The two men complemented each other in ways that, during the early years of their partnership, produced something genuinely impressive. Together they founded Green Desk, a shared workspace concept in Brooklyn that incorporated environmentally sustainable design principles and that attracted a community of freelancers and small business owners who appreciated both the aesthetic quality of the space and the values it seemed to embody. Green Desk worked. It worked well enough that Neumann and McKelvey were able to sell it at a profit, and it was the proceeds of that sale, combined with the conviction that the concept could be scaled far beyond a single Brooklyn location, that provided the foundation for the company they launched in 2010. They called it WeWork, and from the very first day the name was the point. Not I work, not my work. We. The community was not just a feature of the product, it was the product. Or at least, it was supposed to be. The early years of WeWork were, by most accounts, genuinely exciting in a way that the later years of excess and dysfunction sometimes cause people to forget. Neumann and McKelvey opened their first location in Soho, in Manhattan, in 2010 and filled it quickly with the kind of tenants they had envisioned. Freelancers, small startups, creative professionals who wanted a workspace that felt like something more than a generic office, but who could not afford the commercial rents that traditional Manhattan office space commanded. The space was warm and thoughtfully designed, with exposed brick and comfortable communal areas, and the kind of aesthetic that said, "We take your work seriously, and we think where you do it matters," without saying anything as crude as, "This is a product you are paying for." Or Neumann was everywhere in those early days, meeting tenants, listening to their stories, incorporating their feedback, selling the vision of what WeWork was going to become with an energy and an authenticity that the people who were present for it have consistently described as genuinely infectious. Miguel McKelvey was designing spaces with a care and an intelligence that translated directly into the quality of the experience tenants had when they walked through the door every morning. The combination worked, WeWork grew, it opened new locations, it raised capital, it expanded to new cities, and with each expansion, the story got bigger. The vision got more ambitious. The language around what WeWork was and what it was going to become got more elevated and more cosmic and more disconnected, by increments that were each individually small enough to seem harmless, from the straightforward commercial reality of a company that rented office space to people who needed it. The first serious outside investment in WeWork came in 2012 when the venture capital firm Benchmark invested approximately $17 million in the company, valuing it at $97 million. This was, by the standards of early-stage venture investment, a significant commitment to a company that was essentially a real estate operation dressed in the language of technology and community. But Benchmark was not investing in the real estate. They were investing in Adam Neumann, in his ability to tell the story, in his capacity to make the people in the room with him feel that what he was building was something genuinely different from anything that had existed before it. And that investment decision, which in isolation was perfectly defensible as a bet on a talented and ambitious founder, set in motion a dynamic that would define everything that followed. Because when Benchmark said yes, they were not just providing capital, they were validating the story. They were confirming, with the credibility of one of the most respected names in Silicon Valley venture capital, that Adam Neumann's vision was worth betting on. And that validation, that external confirmation of what he already believed about himself, fed something in Neumann that, according to the people who watched him most closely over the following years, it did not make him more measured or more careful or more attentive to the gap between the story and the reality. It made him more certain, more expansive, more convinced than ever that the rules that governed ordinary businesses and ordinary founders did not apply to him. And from that conviction, held with absolute sincerity and projected with extraordinary force onto everyone around him, everything that followed was, in some sense, already written. In January 2017, Masayoshi Son, the founder and chief executive of SoftBank, and the manager of the $100 billion vision fund that he had assembled with capital from sources including the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi Arabia, visited WeWork's offices in New York City. So what happened in that meeting has since become one of the most analyzed and most debated episodes in the recent history of venture capital, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. Sun spent approximately 12 minutes in the space. He did not conduct a detailed financial review. He did not sit down with WeWork's chief financial officer and go through the unit economics of the company's lease portfolio. He walked through the offices, absorbed the atmosphere that Neumann and McKelvey had created, and had a conversation with Neumann that, according to multiple accounts of what was said, centered not on the financial details of what WeWork currently was, but on the visionary dimensions of what it could become. At the end of those 12 minutes, Sun reportedly told Neumann that he was thinking too small, that the scale of the opportunity in front of him required a far more aggressive deployment of capital than WeWork had been pursuing. That in the competition between smart and crazy wins. And then Sun offered to invest $4.4 billion in WeWork, giving the company a valuation of approximately $20 billion and transforming it, in a single conversation that lasted about the length of a television episode, from a successful and impressive business into something that the financial world was now required to take seriously at an entirely different order of magnitude. The SoftBank investment changed everything. It changed the financial resources available to Neumann. It changed the competitive landscape by giving WeWork the capital to expand into new markets faster than any competitor could match. It changed the public narrative around the company by attaching to it the credibility and the scale of one of the most prominent technology investors in the world. And it changed Adam Neumann. Not in a way that was immediately obvious, or that any single person close to him could point to as a clear before and after, but in the way that an enormous and sudden external validation of everything you have always believed about yourself changes a person who was already, before the validation arrived, operating at the very edge of the boundary between extraordinary confidence and the kind of certainty that stops listening. The money from SoftBank was not just capital, it was confirmation. It was Masayoshi Son, with his $100 billion fund and his track record of transformative technology bets, looking Adam Neumann in the eye and telling him that his instincts were right, that his vision was real, that the people who had been raising concerns about WeWork's financials and governance and decision-making were thinking too small. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life operating on the conviction that he was right and the doubters were wrong, that confirmation was, in the assessment of many people who knew him well during this period, the most dangerous thing that could have happened to him. WeWork's expansion in the years following the SoftBank investment was extraordinary in its speed and its ambition, and as the subsequent financial analysis would make clear, in its cost. The company opened new locations at a pace that its operational infrastructure struggled to keep up with. It moved into markets where the economics were less favorable than its core American locations. It launched new business lines, WeLive, a co-living concept, and WeGrow, a private elementary school, among others, that extended the WeWork brand into areas far removed from the shared workspace business that was the company's actual source of revenue. WeGrow, the elementary school that Neumann and his wife Rebecca launched, was, according to multiple accounts, deeply personal to both of them, and reflected a genuine belief that the educational philosophy they wanted to embody in the school was important and worth pursuing. But it was also a significant distraction of executive attention and company resources at precisely the moment when the core business was expanding so rapidly that it required the full and undivided focus of the leadership team to manage the growth responsibly. The company was, by 2018, losing money at a rate that any traditional financial analysis would have identified as deeply concerning. It lost $1.9 billion in 2018. It was on track to lose significantly more in 2019. The losses were not the result of a temporary investment phase that would resolve into profitability once the expansion was complete. They were structural. They were built into the fundamental economics of a business model that required WeWork to commit to long-term lease obligations while collecting short-term rental revenue from tenants who could leave on relatively short notice. The governance problems at WeWork during this period were, in the assessment of corporate governance experts who examined them both at the time and in the aftermath of the collapse, extraordinary in their extent and in the degree to which they concentrated power in a single individual in ways that removed almost every conventional check on that individual's decision-making. Neumann's dual-class share structure gave him approximately 20 times the voting power of ordinary shareholders, meaning that the board of directors, whose function in a normal corporate governance arrangement is to represent the interests of shareholders and to provide oversight of management, had in practice very limited ability to constrain him. If the board wanted to go in one direction and Neumann wanted to go in another, Neumann's votes would always prevail. This structure is not, in itself, unique in the technology sector. Dual-class share structures that give founders enhanced voting control are common among major technology companies, including Google, Facebook, and others. What was unusual about WeWork's arrangement was the degree of the disparity and the specific ways in which Neumann had used his control to authorize transactions that benefited him personally in ways that created direct conflicts of interest with the company's other stakeholders. And the trademark transaction, in which he personally registered the word "we" and then sold it back to WeWork for $5.9 million, was perhaps the most straightforward example. The property transactions in which he purchased buildings and then leased them to WeWork, creating a situation in which he was simultaneously negotiating on behalf of both the landlord and the tenant, were more complex but equally problematic from a governance standpoint. Both arrangements were, according to people who reviewed them, the kind of transactions that would have been stopped early and firmly in a company with a functioning independent board and a governance culture that prioritized the interests of all stakeholders rather than primarily the interests of its founder. By the time WeWork began preparing for its initial public offering in 2019, the company had raised billions of dollars across multiple funding rounds and was carrying a valuation of $47 billion, a number that SoftBank's continued investment had been the primary driver of, and that represented, in the view of a growing number of serious financial analysts, one of the most significant disconnects between a private company's stated valuation and its underlying financial reality in the recent history of American business. The IPO process, which required WeWork to file a public prospectus detailing its financial condition, was supposed to be the moment of triumph. The validation, before the broadest possible audience of institutional and retail investors, of everything Neumann had built and everything he had said it was worth. Instead, it became something else entirely. The S1 prospectus that WeWork filed publicly in August 2019 was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable documents to emerge from the IPO process in the modern era. It used the word community 150 times. It described the company's mission as elevating the world's consciousness. It included a letter from Neumann that read more like a spiritual manifesto than a corporate disclosure. And buried within its financial tables and footnotes and risk factor disclosures, it revealed to anyone willing to read carefully enough the full extent of the gap between the story WeWork had been telling about itself and the financial reality that the story had been covering. The self-dealing transactions, the governance arrangements, the losses, the structural vulnerability of the business model. All of it was there, required by law to be disclosed, impossible to hide from the analysts and journalists who descended on the document within hours of its public filing and began, with remarkable speed and remarkable unanimity, to say out loud what many of them had been saying privately for years. The financial press response to the WeWork S1 was swift, and it was devastating. Analysts who had followed the company for years and who had, in some cases, maintained a public posture of cautious optimism about its prospects found themselves, in the face of the documented financial reality that the prospectus revealed, unable to sustain that posture. The valuation was not defensible at $47 billion. It was not defensible at $30 billion. Some analysts suggested the company might be worth $8 billion. Some suggested less. The losses were too large, the path to profitability too uncertain, the governance too compromised, and the gap between the story and the reality too wide for the market to accept the number that SoftBank's investment had implied. And as the financial press published its assessments, and the institutional investors who had been planning to participate in the IPO began revising their own views of what the company was worth, a dynamic began to unfold inside WeWork and inside its board of directors that had been building, according to people who were present for it, for longer than the IPO process itself. The weeks between the public filing of WeWork's S1 prospectus in August 2019, and the formal withdrawal of the IPO on September 30th, 2019 were, by the account of everyone who lived through them from the inside, unlike anything they had previously experienced in their professional lives. The speed of the deterioration, the public nature of it, the sense, as each day brought new reporting and new analysis and new revelations about the gap between WeWork's stated valuation and its documented financial reality, that something which had seemed solid and permanent just weeks earlier was dissolving in real time, and that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Because the information was now public. The prospectus had been filed. The financial details were there for anyone who wanted to read them. And the people who read them most carefully, the institutional investors whose participation was essential for the IPO to succeed, the analysts whose assessments shaped the market's view of what the company was worth, and the journalists whose reporting reached the millions of ordinary people who had heard of WeWork and were forming their own judgments about what it represented, were reaching conclusions that the $47 billion valuation could not survive. The IPO Roadshow, the series of presentations to institutional investors that typically precedes a public listing and that serves as the final sales effort before the company's shares begin trading, was, according to multiple accounts of people who were present for portions of it, a deeply uncomfortable experience. Neumann was presenting to rooms full of sophisticated financial professionals who had read the S1 and who had questions that the language of community and consciousness and the elevation of the world's spiritual awareness was not equipped to answer. And they wanted to know about the path to profitability. They wanted to understand how the structural mismatch between WeWork's long-term lease obligations and its short-term tenant relationships would be managed in a downturn. They wanted explanations for the self-dealing transactions and the governance arrangements that gave a single individual near absolute control over a company they were being asked to own a piece of. And Neumann, who had spent 9 years in rooms where his force of personality and his extraordinary storytelling ability had been sufficient to move the conversation away from uncomfortable questions and toward the larger vision he was selling, found himself in rooms where that force was meeting, for perhaps the first time at scale, a resistance that it could not overcome. The investors were not hostile. Seeing they were not unkind, they were simply doing the job that their own fiduciary responsibilities required them to do. And the answers they were receiving to their questions were not sufficient. The board of directors of WeWork had been for years in the position of a group of adults who have watched a situation develop in a direction they are not entirely comfortable with, and who have, for various reasons, financial incentive, personal loyalty, institutional momentum, the difficulty of confronting a founder who controls enough votes to override any decision they make, chosen to accommodate rather than confront. The governance arrangements they had accepted, the self-dealing transactions they had reviewed and signed off on, the increasingly expansive personal behavior they had observed and discussed, and, in most cases, I declined to address with the directness that the situation arguably required. All of it had been possible to sustain as long as the story was working, as long as the valuation was rising and the press was largely reverential and the money was flowing from investors who wanted to be part of whatever WeWork was becoming. But now the story was not working. The valuation was collapsing in public, in real time, in the pages of every major financial publication in America. And the board found itself facing a question it could no longer defer. The question of whether Adam Neumann, the man whose vision and whose force of personality had built everything they were now responsible for governing, was the right person to lead the company through what was coming next, and or whether the company's survival, and the survival of the jobs and the investments and the commitments that depended on it, required them to make a different choice. On September 24, 2019, Adam Neumann resigned as chief executive of WeWork. The resignation came after days of intense negotiations between Neumann and the board, negotiations that were reported in real time by journalists who were receiving information from multiple sources inside the company and inside the investment community that surrounded it. SoftBank, which had invested billions of dollars in WeWork and which now found itself facing the prospect of those investments being worth a fraction of what it had paid for them, played a central role in the pressure that led to Neumann's departure. Masayoshi Son, who had told Neumann in 2017 that crazy was better than smart, and who had handed him billions of dollars based on a 12-minute conversation, was now, according to reports from the period, Among those who had concluded that Neumann's continued presence as chief executive was the single largest obstacle to stabilizing the company and preserving whatever value remained. The irony of that reversal, the same man who had arguably done more than anyone outside of Neumann himself to inflate the story, to the point where its collapse became inevitable, now being among those who determined that Neumann had to go, was not lost on the journalists and analysts who were covering the story. But it was also, in the context of the scale of SoftBank's financial exposure, entirely understandable as a matter of institutional self-interest. The exit package that Neumann received in connection with his resignation was, and remains, one of the most discussed and most contested elements of the entire WeWork story. He received approximately $1.7 billion in exchange for relinquishing his supervoting shares and stepping away from the company. The package included the purchase of his shares at a price that reflected a valuation far above what the market had determined the company was worth, a consulting arrangement, and the forgiveness of a personal loan he had taken from WeWork. The $1.7 billion figure was not a secret. It was reported widely and immediately, within days of Neumann's departure. And the response to it, from former employees, from financial analysts, from journalists, and from ordinary people who had followed the story, was one of the more striking expressions of collective moral discomfort that the American business world had witnessed in recent years. Because in the same weeks that Neumann was receiving $1.7 billion to leave, WeWork was preparing to lay off approximately 2,400 employees. People who had worked long hours for below-market salaries in exchange for equity that was now worth a fraction of what they had been told. People who had turned down other opportunities and made significant life decisions on the basis of a valuation that had turned out to be, in the market's assessment, essentially fictional. The contrast between the founder's exit and the employee experience was not a subtle one, and it generated a conversation about accountability, or about the distribution of consequences in corporate failure, and about the specific ways in which the governance structures and the investor protections that had been built around Adam Neumann had insulated him from the most severe consequences of the choices he had made, while leaving the people with the least power and the least protection to absorb the full weight of those consequences that has continued in various forms ever since. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation into WeWork's financial disclosures and the circumstances of the failed IPO. The investigation examined, among other things, whether the disclosures made to investors during the fundraising rounds that had produced the $47 billion valuation had been accurate and complete, whether the self-dealing transactions had been properly disclosed and properly authorized, and whether the governance arrangements that concentrated near absolute power in Neumann had been adequately communicated to the investors who had committed billions of dollars to the company on the basis of the information they had been given. The investigation was reported widely at the time, and its progress tracked by journalists and financial analysts who understood that its conclusions would have implications not just for WeWork and Adam Neumann specifically, but for the broader ecosystem of late-stage private company investing that had produced the extraordinary valuations of the unicorn era. According to reports at the time of this recording, the regulatory proceedings related to WeWork's conduct during this period were still working their way through the relevant processes. Former employees began speaking to journalists. The accounts they gave painted a picture of a workplace that was, in many respects, genuinely extraordinary. Creative, energetic, committed to a mission that most of the people who worked there had believed in deeply and had been proud to be part of. But they also described a culture in which the founder's authority was so absolute and so thoroughly woven into the company's identity that raising concerns about the direction of the business had felt to many people less like a professional responsibility and more like a personal betrayal. In a community, and WeWork's internal culture used that word as deliberately and as pervasively as its external communications did, dissent carries a different weight than it does in an ordinary corporate environment. To question the direction of the community, to raise doubts about the judgment of the person who had founded it and whose vision had brought everyone in the room together, was to position yourself as an outsider in a culture that had made belonging its central value. And that dynamic, the use of community language and community feeling as a mechanism, whether intentional or not, for suppressing the kind of critical internal dialogue that might have caught the problems earlier, is one of the most uncomfortable threads running through the entire WeWork story. Because it suggests that the thing WeWork was selling, the feeling of belonging, of being part of something larger than yourself, of work as a form of shared purpose rather than mere commercial transaction, was also, in some respects, the mechanism by which the people inside the company were prevented from seeing clearly what they were actually part of. The question of what everyone outside WeWork knew, and when they knew, it is one that the reporting from this period raises in ways that are genuinely difficult to resolve cleanly. The Wall Street Journal's Elliot Brown, who covered WeWork for years and whose reporting during the IPO period was among the most consequential journalism to emerge from the story, has written about the challenge of covering a private company in the unicorn era, where the information available to journalists is limited by the company's ability to control what it discloses, and where the financial incentives of the investors and advisors surrounding the company create a powerful structural pressure against the kind of critical scrutiny that public companies face as a matter of routine. The people who had the most complete picture of WeWork's financial condition and governance were, in most cases, the people who had the most to lose from that picture becoming public. And the people who were asking the hardest questions from the outside, the journalists, the short sellers, the skeptical analysts, were working with incomplete information against a company and a network of investors and advisors that was extremely well-resourced and extremely motivated to manage the narrative. The fact that the truth eventually came out, completely and publicly and with consequences that the narrative management could not prevent, is in some respects a testament to the limits of story as a substitute for substance. But it is also worth sitting with the question of how much damage was done in the years between when the concerns were first articulable and when they finally became impossible to suppress. In the months following Adam Neumann's removal from WeWork in September 2019, something interesting happened in the public conversation about what had occurred. The story, which had initially been told primarily as a financial story, a story about valuation and governance and the specific mechanics of how a $47 billion number had been constructed and then dismantled, began to evolve into something larger and more cultural and more psychologically complex. Journalists who had covered the rise of WeWork began going back through their notes and their sources and their own published accounts and asking a question that the speed of the collapse had initially made difficult to examine carefully. Not what happened, but how. Not what the specific decisions were that led to the specific outcomes, but what kind of environment, what kind of culture, what kind of collective human dynamic makes it possible for a story of that magnitude to sustain itself for that long, against the weight of the evidence that was accumulating against it. And the answers they found, documented in a series of books and documentaries and long-form investigative pieces that emerged over the 2 years following the collapse, were more complicated and more uncomfortable and more universally applicable than the simple narrative of one arrogant man destroying everything around him had initially suggested. The first major book-length account of the WeWork story was published in 2021 by Wall Street Journal reporter Elliot Brown and his colleague Maureen Farrell. The book was titled The Cult of We, and the choice of that title was deliberate and precise. Because what Brown and Farrell documented, say across hundreds of pages of reported narrative drawing on interviews with dozens of current and former WeWork employees, investors, board members, and advisors, was not simply a story of financial fraud or corporate governance failure in the conventional sense. It was a story about the specific and powerful dynamic that develops when a charismatic leader surrounds themselves with true believers, when the language of mission and community and shared purpose becomes the primary filter through which all information inside an organization is processed, and when the external validation of that leader's vision, the rising valuations, the magazine covers, the investor commitments, when the cultural celebrity becomes so overwhelming that the people best positioned to ask the hardest questions find themselves psychologically and institutionally unable to ask them. The cult dynamic that Brown and Farrell described was not, in their account, a cynical manipulation. It was, in many respects, a genuine expression of something Neumann actually believed. He believed in the community. He believed in the mission. He believed, with what appears to have been complete sincerity, that WeWork was something more than a real estate company, and that the people who reduced it to its financial mechanics were missing something essential about what it was and what it was going to become. And that genuine belief, that authentic, deeply held conviction, was precisely what made it so effective as a mechanism for preventing the critical examination that might have changed the outcome. the Hulu documentary WeWork, or the making and breaking of a $47 billion unicorn, released in April 2021, brought the story to an audience far beyond the financial press and the business school case study circuit. The documentary drew on extensive interview footage, including with Neumann himself in the period of his ascent, and presented the WeWork story in a way that made its emotional dimensions as accessible as its financial ones. Audiences who had never heard of a dual-class share structure or a special-purpose acquisition company found themselves genuinely moved by the accounts of former employees who described believing completely in what they were building and then watching it collapse around them. They found themselves fascinated by the footage of Neumann in his prime, the physical presence, the verbal certainty, the extraordinary capacity for projecting a version of the future so vividly that the people in the room with him felt they could almost touch it. And they found themselves asking the question that the best documentaries always leave their audiences asking, which is not a question about the specific people on screen, but a question about the universal human patterns those specific people illuminate. How do we know when we are following a genuine vision and when we are following a performance of one? How do we distinguish between the leader who is confidently certain because they are right and the leader who is confidently certain because their certainty has become impermeable to evidence? And what responsibility do we bear, as employees and investors, and advisors, and journalists, and ordinary observers, for the outcomes produced by systems we participate in without examining closely enough? Apple TV Plus released We Crashed in March 2022, a dramatized series based on the WeWork story in which Jared Leto played Adam Neumann and Anne Hathaway played his wife Rebecca. The series was not a documentary and made no claim to be a precise factual account of specific events. But it was, or in the assessment of many people who had been involved in the actual story and who watched it, remarkably accurate in its rendering of the emotional and psychological dynamics that had driven the real events. The portrayal of Neumann as a man of genuine gifts and genuine vision, whose gifts and vision had become so thoroughly entangled with his ego that he was no longer able to distinguish between them, resonated with people who had known him and worked with him in ways that purely financial accounts of the story had not quite managed to capture. The portrayal of the culture around him, the true believers and the accommodators and the people who had private doubts but chose, for various reasons, to keep those doubts private, was, according to former WeWork employees who spoke about the series publicly, uncomfortably recognizable. And the portrayal of the human cost, the employees, the co-founder, the family members whose lives were shaped by the consequences of choices they had not been in a position to prevent, added a dimension of emotional weight to the story that the balance sheets and the governance analyses had not been designed to carry. But here is where the story takes the turn that stopped the financial world cold. Because in August 2022, less than 3 years after the collapse of the WeWork IPO, and less than a year after the documentaries and the dramatizations had cemented the story's place in the cultural conversation as one of the defining cautionary tales of the Silicon Valley era, Adam Neumann announced the launch of a new company. He called it Flaw. The concept was focused on residential real estate, specifically on the idea of transforming the experience of renting an apartment by creating communities within residential buildings, incorporating technology to improve the tenant experience, and applying the lessons of WeWork's shared workspace model to the way people lived rather than the way they worked. The announcement was made through a blog post published by the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, written by the firm's co-founder Mark Andreessen, which described Neumann as a visionary entrepreneur whose understanding of real estate and community was uniquely valuable and whose ambition to reimagine urban living represented an opportunity that Andreessen Horowitz was proud to support. The firm announced that it was investing $350 million in Flaw, giving the company a valuation of over $1 billion before it had launched a single product, signed a single lease in its own name, or generated a single dollar of revenue. The reaction to the Flaw announcement in the financial press and the technology community was, to put it mildly, significant. The coverage ranged from skeptical to openly incredulous, with a substantial portion falling somewhere closer to the incredulous end of the spectrum. Because the facts of the situation were, to anyone who had been paying attention to the WeWork story, almost impossible to process without some degree of cognitive dissonance. Here was a man who had presided over one of the most dramatic destructions of shareholder and stakeholder value in modern American corporate history. Here was a man whose conduct as chief executive had been documented in extraordinary detail by investigative journalists, regulatory filings, court documents, a major book, a Hulu documentary, and an Apple TV Plus series, all of which had concluded, in their various ways, that his judgment, his governance practices, and his relationship with the boundary between his personal interests and his company's interests had been deeply problematic. Here was a man who had walked away from the wreckage of WeWork with $1.7 billion, while thousands of his employees lost significant portions of their compensation. And one of the most prestigious and influential venture capital firms in Silicon Valley was giving him $350 million and a billion-dollar valuation to do essentially the same thing again, before the product existed, before the revenue existed, before there was any evidence that the specific problems that had destroyed WeWork had been identified, examined, and addressed in any meaningful way. Mark Andreessen's blog post explaining the investment acknowledged WeWork directly and did not pretend that the history did not exist. It argued that Neumann had learned from the experience, that his understanding of the real estate market and his ability to build community within physical spaces represented genuine and valuable expertise, and that the opportunity in residential real estate was sufficiently large that backing the right visionary to pursue it was worth the risks that the WeWork history implied. These were not unreasonable arguments in isolation. The residential real estate market is, by any measure, one of the largest and most consequential markets in the American economy. The experience of renting in American cities had become, for millions of people, an increasingly expensive and increasingly impersonal transaction that had very little to do with community or belonging or the quality of daily life. And Neumann, whatever his failures as a public company executive, did have a demonstrated ability to create physical spaces that people wanted to inhabit and to build. At least initially, and at least in the context of commercial real estate, communities within those spaces that felt genuine. The investment was not irrational. But it was, in the view of a significant portion of the people who analyzed it, a statement about the specific ways in which the venture capital ecosystem processes accountability. Or, more precisely, that's about the specific ways in which that ecosystem sometimes fails to process it. That went beyond the specific merits of flow as a business opportunity. Because the question that the Andreessen Horowitz investment in flow forced into the open was not really a question about flow. It was a question about what accountability means in the context of enormous wealth and enormous charisma, and the specific networks of relationship and financial interest that connect the people who move capital in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street. It was a question about whether the consequences of the choices Adam Neumann made at WeWork, consequences that were borne most heavily by the employees who lost their jobs, and the small investors who lost their money, and the co-founder who watched his life's work become defined by his partner's conduct, had been distributed in a way that bore any meaningful relationship to the distribution of responsibility for those choices. And it was a question about whether the systems that are supposed to prevent the specific kind of damage that WeWork produced, the governance structures, the fiduciary obligations, the regulatory frameworks, the professional norms of the investment banking and venture capital communities, had performed their function adequately. The answer to that last question, in the view of many of the analysts and journalists and former WeWork employees who examined it, was that they had not, and that the Andreessen Horowitz investment in flow was, whatever its specific merits as a financial decision, a fairly clear signal that the system had processed the WeWork experience in a way that left the people most responsible for its outcomes largely insulated from its consequences. Which is perhaps the most important and the most uncomfortable thing that the entire story has to say. Not about Adam Neumann specifically, but about the structures and the incentives and the cultural values of the world in which he operated, and about what it means, in that world, to fail, and what it means in that world to be held accountable for it. WeWork filed for bankruptcy protection in November 2023. The company that had once been valued at $47 billion, that had once described its mission as elevating the world's consciousness, that had once been held up as the defining expression of a new and more human approach to the way people worked and connected and built their professional lives, was unable to meet its financial obligations. The long-term lease commitments that had been identified as a structural vulnerability years before the IPO collapse had become, in the post-pandemic environment where the demand for traditional office space had fallen sharply and in many markets permanently, an existential burden that the company's revenue could no longer support. The bankruptcy filing was processed in the cold and procedural language of financial restructuring. But behind the procedural language was the human reality of thousands of employees whose professional lives were again disrupted, of landlords who were left holding leases that the company could no longer honor, of members whose workspace arrangements were thrown into uncertainty, and of investors who had committed capital on the basis of a story that had, across 4 years and two major corporate crises, conclusively demonstrated its inability to translate into a sustainable business. The empire that Adam Neumann had built with such extraordinary force and such absolute conviction had, in the end, proven to be exactly what the most skeptical analysts had said it was from the beginning. A story. A remarkable, compelling, beautifully told, and ultimately insufficient story. There is a moment in the WeWork story that almost every account of it mentions, and that almost every account of it moves past too quickly. It happened in the weeks immediately following Adam Neumann's removal as chief executive in September 2019, in the period when the full scale of what had occurred was still being processed by the financial press, and by the thousands of people whose professional and financial lives had been shaped by the company's collapse. Neumann gave an interview, not a long interview, not a formal sit-down with a major publication designed to present a carefully managed version of his perspective on what had happened. A brief, informal exchange with a reporter in which he was asked, in essence, what he thought had gone wrong. And his answer, according to the accounts of people who were present for it and who have described it in the reporting that followed, was striking not for what it acknowledged, but for what it did not. He spoke about the speed of the growth. He spoke about the challenges of scaling a company as fast as WeWork had scaled. He spoke about the difficulty of the market environment and the complexity of the IPO process. He did not speak, at least not in any substantive or specific way, about the self-dealing transactions. He did not speak about the governance arrangements that had concentrated near absolute power in his hands and removed the checks that might have caught the problems earlier. He did not speak about the employees who were about to lose their jobs. He did not speak about the gap between the story he had been telling about WeWork and the financial reality that the story had been covering. And that absence, that specific and conspicuous silence in the accounting he offered of what had occurred, is, I think, the most revealing single detail in the entire story. Not because it proves something about Adam Neumann's character that nothing else in the story suggests, but because it confirms something that everything else in the story suggests. That the pride at the center of this story was not a performance. It was not a calculated pose, adopted for strategic reasons and capable of being set aside when the circumstances required a different approach. It was structural. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire psychological architecture. And when the building came down, or the wall was still standing. To understand what pride of that particular kind actually costs, you have to be willing to look past the financial numbers and past the governance failures and past the specific decisions that produce the specific outcomes, and ask a harder question. You have to ask what Adam Neumann's life actually looked like from the inside during the years when WeWork was at its peak. Because the picture that emerges from the reporting, from the accounts of the people who were closest to him during those years, from the descriptions of his daily life and his decision-making and his relationships with the people around him, is not the picture of a man who was happy. It is the picture of a man who was performing happiness on a scale so grand and so sustained that distinguishing the performance from the reality had become, for the people around him, and perhaps for Neumann himself, genuinely difficult. The private jet flights, the tequila, the surfing trips and the parties and the enormous houses and the celebrity friendships and the meetings with world leaders and the magazine covers. All of it real, all of it documented, and all of it, according to the accounts of people who were present for it, carrying an undertone of compulsion that is difficult to square with the image of a man who had found what he was looking for. Because a man who has genuinely found what he is looking for does not need to keep searching at that velocity, does not need to keep expanding, keep acquiring, keep performing, keep pushing the number higher and the story larger and the vision more cosmic. A man who has genuinely found what he is looking for can sometimes simply stop. And Adam Neumann, by every account of the people who knew him during the WeWork years, was constitutionally incapable of stopping, not because he was greedy in the conventional sense, but because the thing he was actually looking for was not something that $47 billion and a private jet and a meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel could provide. And some part of him, buried beneath the extraordinary confidence and the extraordinary charisma and the extraordinary force of will, knew that, and kept searching anyway. The cost of that searching, measured not in dollars but in the currency that actually matters, was borne by people who had no meaningful say in the choices that produced it. Miguel McKelvey, the quiet architect from Oregon who had co-founded WeWork with Neumann and who had spent 9 years building something he was genuinely proud of, watched the company they had created together become defined in the public memory and in the cultural conversation and in the business school case studies, not by the design intelligence he had brought to it or by the genuine community that the best WeWork spaces had managed to create, but by the behavior of his partner. McKelvey gave very few public interviews during and after the collapse. The accounts that exist of his experience during this period describe a man who was deeply hurt by what had happened and deeply reluctant to say so publicly, which is itself a kind of testament to the specific decency that had made him, in many respects, are the more admirable of the two founders and the less visible one. The 2,400 employees who lost their jobs in the restructuring that followed Neumann's departure were not abstractions. They were people with mortgages and families and professional identities that had been built around a company and a mission they had believed in. They were people who had accepted below-market salaries in exchange for equity that turned out to be worth a fraction of what they had been told. They were people who had turned down other opportunities because WeWork had seemed like the place where the most interesting and most important work was happening. And the accountability they received for the consequences they bore was, by any measure of proportionality, deeply inadequate. In the investors who lost money in WeWork, and there were many of them, from the sophisticated institutional investors who had participated in the late-stage funding rounds to the public market investors who bought shares after the company eventually listed through its special purpose acquisition company merger in 2021, had at least the partial consolation of understanding that investment in high-growth companies carries risk and that the risk, in this case, had materialized in a way that the available information should arguably have allowed them to anticipate. The employees had no such consolation. They had not been investors making informed risk assessments with capital they could afford to lose. They had been workers, providing their labor and their expertise and their professional commitment to an organization they trusted to deal honestly with them about its condition and its prospects. And the question of whether that trust was honored, whether the information available to WeWork's leadership about the company's financial condition and its governance problems was shared with employees in a way that allowed them to make genuinely informed decisions about their own professional futures, is one that the reporting from this period answers at best uncomfortably. Now, I want to come to the thing that I said earlier in this video I would return to. The detail that most accounts of the WeWork story mention briefly and then move past. And that detail is this. In the months after Neumann's departure, as the restructuring was being implemented and the employees were being laid off and the SEC investigation was getting underway and the financial press was processing the full scale of what had occurred, Neumann was, by multiple accounts, genuinely surprised by the intensity of the negative reaction to his exit package. Not to the governance failures, not to the self-dealing transactions, not to the specific decisions that had contributed to the collapse, but to the $1.7 billion. He had, according to people who spoke with him during this period, a difficult time understanding why the receipt of $1.7 billion in the context of a company he had founded and built over 9 years was being received as a moral failure rather than a contractual outcome. He had negotiated the package, and the board had agreed to it. The lawyers had documented it. The process had been followed. And in the world in which Adam Neumann had operated for the previous decade, the world of late-stage venture capital and unicorn valuations and founder-friendly governance structures and the specific ecosystem of financial relationships that had surrounded WeWork during its ascent. The logic he was applying was not entirely foreign to the norms of that world. Founders who build companies are expected to be compensated for what they build. The mechanisms through which that compensation is structured and delivered are a matter of negotiation and contract. The fact that the company had collapsed did not, in the strict contractual sense, invalidate the arrangements that had been made. And Neumann, according to these accounts, I understood his situation through that contractual lens rather than through the moral lens that the employees who had lost their jobs and the investors who had lost their money and the journalists who were covering the story were applying to it. The gap between those two lenses, the contractual and the moral, is, I think, one of the most important things about this story. Not because it is unique to Adam Neumann, but because it is not. Because the WeWork story, for all its specific and dramatic particularity, is also a story about a much more broadly applicable human truth. It is a story about what happens when a person's understanding of their own position in the world becomes so thoroughly shaped by the systems and the incentives and the cultural values of the environment they operate in that they lose access to the simpler and more universal moral framework that the people outside that environment are using to evaluate their conduct. Adam Neumann did not invent the governance structures that gave him 20 times the voting power of ordinary shareholders. He did not invent the financial mechanisms that allowed WeWork to raise billions of dollars at a valuation that most serious analysts believed was disconnected from the company's underlying financial reality. He did not invent the culture of Silicon Valley and the venture capital ecosystem that rewarded the performance of visionary certainty over the demonstration of financial discipline. He operated within those structures and those mechanisms in that culture. He used them skillfully and aggressively and, in some cases, in ways that the people who designed them arguably did not intend. But he did not create them. And the system that produced Adam Neumann, that rewarded his particular combination of gifts and tolerated his particular combination of flaws for as long as it was financially convenient to do so, and then discarded him when it became financially inconvenient, is still operating. It is still rewarding the same combination of gifts. It is still tolerating the same combination of flaws in other people, in other companies, when at this precise moment. And the WeWork bankruptcy and the SEC investigation and the documentaries and the dramatizations and all of the cultural processing of what happened have not changed that in any fundamental way, which is perhaps the most important and the most sobering thing that the entire story has to tell us. Not about Adam Neumann, about the world he operated in, and about the question of whether that world is capable of learning from the stories it produces, or whether it is simply capable of processing them, turning them into content, into case studies, into Netflix series and Hulu documentaries and business school discussions, and then continuing with the same structures and the same incentives and the same cultural values to produce more of them. Adam Neumann, at the time of this recording, continues to develop Flow. The company has faced its own challenges and its progress has been slower than the ambition of the original announcement suggested it would be. Whether Flow will succeed or fail is genuinely unknown and genuinely uncertain, and this video makes no prediction about it. What is known is that Neumann has continued, in the face of one of the most public and thoroughly documented corporate failures in recent American business history, to pursue his vision with the same essential confidence and the same essential conviction that defined his approach to WeWork. So whether that represents genuine learning, a processing of the WeWork experience that has produced a more grounded and more accountable version of the same fundamental gifts, or whether it represents the continuation of the same pattern with a different company name and a different product category is something that only time and evidence will answer. The people who invested $350 million in Flow have made their bet. The people who have chosen to work for Flow have made their choice. And the rest of us are, in a sense, waiting to see which version of the story this is. The comeback of a genuinely chastened and genuinely evolved entrepreneur who has taken the hardest lessons of the hardest experience of his professional life and used them to build something more durable and more honest than what came before, or the continuation of a pattern that the WeWork story illustrated with such painful clarity. The pattern of a man whose extraordinary gifts and whose extraordinary pride are so thoroughly entangled that separating them may simply be beyond his reach. WeWork is gone. The $47 billion valuation is gone. The S-1 prospectus that described the company's mission as elevating the world's consciousness is a historical document now, studied in business schools and referenced in journalism courses as a case study in the specific kind of damage that the gap between story and reality can do when the people responsible for closing that gap choose, for long enough and for reasons sufficiently understandable in the context of their own interest and their own psychology, not to close it. Miguel McKelvey, who co-founded the company and who deserved better from the story that his partnership with Adam Neumann produced, has moved on to other work and has done so, by all available accounts, with the quiet dignity that characterized his entire time at WeWork. The 2,400 employees who lost their jobs in 2019, and the additional employees who were affected by the subsequent restructurings and the eventual bankruptcy, have rebuilt their professional lives in the ways that people rebuild their professional lives, some of them in circumstances that required more rebuilding than others, and all of them carrying, to whatever degree and in whatever form, the specific experience of having given themselves to something that did not turn out to be what it said it was. And Adam Neumann has $1.7 billion and a new company, and the same force of personality and the same conviction in his own exceptional destiny that he had on the day he walked into his first WeWork location in Soho in 2010, and began telling the story that would define the next decade of his life. Whether the next chapter of that story is different from the last one is the question that the WeWork story leaves open. And it is, I think, the right question to leave open, because the answer to it is not yet written, and because the answer to it matters not just for Adam Neumann, and for Flo, and for the investors and employees who have chosen to be part of whatever comes next. It matters for all of us who are trying to understand what the WeWork story actually means. What it says about ambition and accountability and the specific and irreducible human cost of pride that refuses to examine itself. What it says about the systems we build and the stories we choose to believe, and the moment, always eventually arriving, when the story and the reality have to be reconciled. And what it says about what we do, individually and collectively, in the aftermath of that reconciliation. Whether we learn, whether we change, or whether we simply move on to the next story and wait for it to end the same way.